I'm Rick from Carthage Classic Cars. We're back on the 70 Cuda build. As you can see, a little bit's changed. I pulled out the dash cross member up here and I installed this support bar. We've done some work up here. We've added aftermarket front torque boxes, and you can see they're bent a little bit because they are not 100% factory, but I believe for this car they're going to be pretty close. Now, I know where they have to be because most of the parts that we're going to install in this video have already been test fit. We're pretty happy with the initial fitment. We got some more pulling and prying to really get them in their permanent location, but all in all, I think everything here is going to be able to go in and be welded. At the end of this video, the goal is to hopefully have most of the front end of the car done. The firewall, cowl panel, the whole floor pan front to rear in this car with the frame rails, torsion bar support, and like I said, it's going to start really looking like a car. So as you could see looking at this car, first thing you see right here is a bunch of rust. The reason is I'm starting to prep these panels. We're putting patches on these panels because this inner structure right here, it was sandblasted on this side. So doing the patch panels, to me, sometimes it's not always worth it removing the whole panel and then we lose a whole structural integrity of the side. If I can know that certain areas up here are still really good, we can leave them on here. Also, this frame jig is not moving anymore. We left a lot of these parts on here, so when we sandblast, with the movement of everything, even with the I-beams, we have a chance of damaging the structure. That's why certain parts were left. Now that we cut them off when we're prepping for our patches, well, we see the backside. And yeah, there's rust on this car. Where we're at right now, why there's still rust here. I did an inner rocker patch down here, which I'm still waiting. I acid treated the inner rocker structure here because that was all rusted, and I knew this, once we blasted it, we exposed all this. So I'm acid treating that. We're gonna do a patch there. And on this panel, we're gonna hold off because I'm gonna email the owner tomorrow, and we're going to find out if this is a panel he wants me to strip down, acid treat, and repair, or is it more cost effective and he wants it 100% perfect, especially with the curvature on the door mount where that went right there, and replace the panel itself. Now, like I said, there's rust behind all these panels. We could assume that anywhere we didn't get behind on this car, there's gonna be rust behind it. Same thing with your Survivor car. Same thing with your restored car. You could assume that nothing in here from the factory had any kind of coating on the inside. They weren't designed to last. So unless you're building one of these cars from exactly nothing, you have to just remember, this is probably lurking on the inside, and you can actually see the spots right there where this car didn't rust. Again, it's all on the inside of the car. It shouldn't get water, that they put no rust prevention. That's why all this is surface rusted. Is it structurally gonna hurt the car? Probably not. So we are replacing this panel anyway. We're gonna do our best to coat the new panels and everything else. And like I said, with this one, we're gonna let the owner make the call on if we're gonna replace this part. If we do replace this part, we will install this part first, the inner door jamb area. That will hold up this whole structure, and then we'll do this outside part second, but we'll figure it out down the road. So like I said, looking at this car, we did some more rocker patching along the whole side. We also, you could see right here on both sides, I drilled my holes, and the rocker panels on the outside already pre-cut down there and on this side. So you could see the rocker panels on the outside were all rusted on both sides. So what we're gonna do, we have the one-piece floor, which we'll go over in a second. We're gonna sit there and we're gonna weld them from the outside rockers in. I think that's gonna be a lot easier, and then we're gonna use these torque boxes in the back as our guide. We're also not gonna weld the rear torque boxes because really, as much as we placed on this car, another thing the owner needs to make a decision, I told him he doesn't have to do it now, is do we just buy the aftermarket rear torque boxes and weld them when the car is all done. So you obviously see there's nothing under here. Our floor supports are in. That's a good guide. I try to keep certain things. They got some rust holes here or there that we're going to weld up through the bottom. We're going to fix them. Again, not a huge issue when what's better is when this much is removed, have certain key pieces here, same thing with these inner rockers, that we can measure our floor off of and make sure we're in good shape. I also know right here, this was drilled right in the old supports, and I already again had this set down, and this floor sits right where it's supposed to be. So hopefully it'll go back the second time. Back here, this is our jig pieces that I've talked about in the past. It's on the car, everything's cut down, everything again on the car has been sandblasted. So our shock tower area should sit right here, and our shackles, these plastic pieces right here, will go inside the shackles of the floor pan. So that's gonna be right here. This is gonna be the first piece we're gonna install. This is a Dynacore full floor for an E-body car. The verdict's still out on them. I put the Dynacore front pieces you'll see in this video, the full build parts, I'm hit or miss on them. There's some great parts to it. It saves me a lot of time, and that's really good. There's things about them that I feel like I could do a little bit better on the fitment and the welding aspect. But again, talk with the owner. This goes with anyone. Any car that comes in here, if you have any questions, like the owner will sit down and say, okay, where do you see this car? What do you want with this car? And that's going to determine the parts. For me, the owner, he's very clear. He knows what he wants on this car, and I think this is going to satisfy what he wants to do with this car and what he wants this car to be. You could see this panel is also covered in a weld-through primer. When we flip it over and we install it, you'll see all the weld-through primer on there. I decided to go ahead, along with all the other parts, the owner wants all these parts in epoxy primer. So we went and I DA sanded. We do these at different levels too. Some owners don't want any coating and they want a fresh coat of epoxy on a sandblasted area, which of course is by far the most superior adhesion. The DA sand, and then I went back with my hand on some red Scotch-Brite and some sandpaper and got in all these crevices. You're still not 100%. You can't get in every crevice by hand, so we do our best we can. So by far, sandblasting is, these parts, dry blasting is the best and I guess the highest quality way to build them. We don't do every car that way. Each owner wants something different for their car, and we're willing to work around it as long as we're not cutting corners and I'm not putting a far inferior product out. So I feel like this could be a really decent product. So no problem. We scuff these parts, we prep the rest of the parts. So let's do this. Let's get to all the parts that we prepped right now. I'll kind of do a quick run through on how I went about this car prepping parts. If you watch other videos of mine, if you're interested in how the sandblasting process works and the outcome on that, check out some other builds. We're doing a 70 Nova right now, and I've also sandblasted all those parts. So check those videos out. We'll show you how this one goes. We'll come back and we'll start automatically installing this floor pan and just start getting to some of the big assembly process and hopefully the welding. And then we'll come back at the end of the video and do a final conclusion. So stay tuned. Let's get to it.
So as I was saying in the intro of the video, step one is going to be we test fit all the parts. They're on the car. I'm happy with everything that I plan on installing in one section, and then we'll go ahead and pull those parts apart. As I'm pulling them apart, what I start doing, I make marks and I take those panels one piece at a time as I'm removing them, and I know where I'm going to drill. It's fresh in your mind versus just marking everything at once, throwing it on the ground. You have a better chance of missing something. So like I said, this toe pan just came off the car. Disassembling the car in reverse order right now, adding all my rosette holes where I have to MIG weld. The floor pan is very different than a lot of other parts of the car where I can utilize my spot welder. A lot of this floor pan, frame rails, everything gets in the way that there's only a few spots on the floor pan that I can use a spot welder. Everything realistically on this car is going to more than likely on the floor pan itself be MIG welded, which is not an issue. It's going to be just as strong, if not stronger. It's just going to take a little bit longer, and we're just going to have a little bit more prep time and everything else when we go ahead and MIG weld it. You could also see once I get done with the rosette holes, I'll sit there and I'll clear out all the areas down to bare metal that we're going to go ahead and add our weld through primer. Those areas have to be and bare metal for the weld through primer to adhere properly. And then if you think about it, if we don't have the weld through primer on bare metal and we go ahead and start welding, the substrate, the e-coat can come up. Well, the weld through primer is not doing its job if it's not the base material. So like I said, I go ahead and I grind it down to bare metal. I add my weld through primer, and you can see the rest of these panels. I'll go ahead and that's what I was saying earlier, what the owner wants. If I go ahead and I sandblast the panels completely, I don't bother with any of the hand sanding, the surface prep disc, anything getting down to bare metal with the belt sander. We're going to blast the whole panel one time and it's just bare metal, and then I'll go right through the weld through primer stage. I will drill out, like I'm doing right now on this floor pan, all my holes first. I'll use the hole punch. This process will be the same, but then instead of stripping down the panel and then DA sanding it, I would take this whole panel out to the dry blast pot and we just blast it one time. With this floor pan on the other side, if you saw, and same thing on the top, I use some paint markers and I'm making myself notes. I'll go ahead and I had this floor pan, like I said, where I wanted it, and I trace out the frame rails underneath. What that's going to do, and I say frame rails, torsion bar support, the front frame rails, anywhere I'm going to have to put these rosette holes. I'll go ahead and that will let me know when I flip it over and I drill my rosette holes for my MIG welder. I know exactly where it is. You will see there's a ton of holes in this floor pan. I am overkill with welding these cars. I come from a racing background and everything, so everything to me cannot be strong enough. I always want to make these cars a lot stronger in factory, and I really, realistically speaking, putting all these rosette holes in there, all these spots are just going to make this car tighten up a whole lot more. I'll show you a couple other tricks I do down the road as we start assembling the frame rails and everything else, some hidden stuff. But again, whether I put a quarter of these spot welds is probably what the factory would put in there. It just saves a little bit of time, but to me, it's a less inferior product and the car's not as strong. So like I said, I'm all about putting a few more MIG holes. I'll do that with the spot welder unless the owner is somehow completely against it, but I've never had anyone say, no, I don't want my car as strong. So that's just a practice I follow. You could see the holes. It's nothing but a little bit more time, but I know when that car goes down the road, that's going to be much stronger and last longer, and we're not going to make cracks in the paint. The chassis will be less likely to warp and other issues just with the body work from a car flexing too much. As you can see with the SCT, I also strip everywhere on the top down to bare metal. This is going to make a better weld that we don't have e-coat and we don't have impurities in the welding. Once I'm done with that, we'll go ahead, like I said, go back through, DA sand with 80 grit following the TDS of the epoxy. And the reason I'm doing these parts now, you can do them on the car, but it's just going to be easier now. If I had to hand sand this whole floor pan upside down underneath the car, or you're climbing in the car, it's a whole lot easier to do this whole process with each part on a body stand, and then you can get everything. The idea now though is we are on a time clock. It's humid out here. We're gonna touch the panels a little bit. We gotta watch to make sure they don't start surface rusting. So right now we need to get these parts installed, and then you're gonna see down the road, we're gonna go back through one more time with the DA and just kind of go over it. So I don't have the floor pan supports in right now. I talked to the owner. It's something that he is gonna maybe install down the road. I just by habit went and put the weld through primer there. Not a huge deal. We're gonna go ahead now that everything's prepped. We're gonna go ahead and start installing this rear Dynacore floor section. You could see Megan and Chase are both helping me, and this is a big, heavy panel. It's a hard job to do, but getting it in there, it really does save a little bit of time, and I really do gotta give it credit to Dynacore right here. These are it's pretty much a whole rear section, bottom of the car all together, and you could see the fitment here. It's fitting right against those torque boxes exactly where it is. It's lined up right against the back rockers, and we really slid right into the shackles. So realistically speaking, I mean, this kind of either also shows the alignment in the back with my jig and everything and how good the jig's been. And I built multiple e-bodies on this jig, and really these panels, I would say this one at least really fit good. So we're going to turn our attention to the front right now. It's going to be the same process. So these are the frame rails with the inner structure pieces put on there. You can see we're going to bolt them how I'm going to do it. Again, I don't think Dynacore designed these pieces to be built this way, but we're going to go ahead and bolt them into the frame jig. You could see the rails are just kind of hanging out, and this is the key to the frame jig. You see how high the frame rails in the back are. They're sitting about 2.5 inches off that torsion bar support. Now that is the alignment marker on the last couple e-bodies we built and the factory cars when they lay on there. Those are pretty tight. So realistically, these rails and everything on this car has to go down in the back. They're just, and I find that with the factory rails too. A lot of times you got to pull them down. But now that we've added these front inner fenders and everything else, it kind of makes these things almost bend up a little bit more and harder to pull. But not a huge issue. This is what I was telling you with the jigs. All we're going to do, we're going to take ratchet straps. You can see Chase is ratcheting it down, and we just pull those rails down, and then they're pulling back into the inner rocker areas where we'll go ahead and clamp them down. Turn our attention to the front and the top areas of the radiator support. Here's another thing. So since these parts are all just kind of put together, and they're not put together in the whole grand scheme of the car in mind, that part is just jigged off that part and thrown together. So realistically, those inner fenders, they want to bend out a lot more. You can see we had to ratchet them in. It's not a huge issue. It just kind of is bending and putting stress on those panels. If I was going to install those parts myself, I feel like there'd be a whole lot less stress on them because I could just put them where they want to go, and we're not bending everything. We're kind of just, it's welding in a certain area where they're welding around all the arches. That gives it that stress. So with putting these panels, I think they're designed to be put without a jig, but actually I think it makes it even harder without a jig because you can't pull and pry on the car. Now, like I said, once I get these the radiator support and everything in these panels and things welded, I think everything's okay. Same thing with this torsion bar. You could see everything just gets pulled down. The torsion bar support, cross member support, is a lot closer. It only had to be pulled down maybe 1/8 of an inch or so, but again, I like to make sure everything is pulled in on the rockers. We took our measurements there, and then we're sitting there and pulling down. Now these frame rails, there's a hole going from the torsion bar support through the front frame rails. Those have to be lined up. I also take some measurements off the bottom, but we're going to use a monkey on the stick. And what we're making sure, we don't want to push the rockers out. So we are, with that big yellow ratchet, yanking the rockers in, holding them solid. They're wrapped around the whole rockers, and then we're pushing out on the monkey on the stick. And then I have all my alignment holes, and we clamp them in place. Once we do that, I'll go ahead and I actually tack the top, and then I'll go through. You can see right here, here's another example that I like to do. I push the corners in, and I also weld the inside of the frame rails. So what that's going to help us do is just give a bunch of hidden welds and strength to this car. Same thing with these front torque boxes. I'll weld both sides of the front torque boxes, which the factory can't do, and you can't do if you do the torque boxes last like the factory would have. But to me, if we weld both sides of the torque boxes, it makes them a lot stronger. So you can see the rosette holes are there. I already have my weld on the inside of this frame rail, and we're just hammering the corners in there. We're filling up the rosette holes, and then we're going to run through, weld the torque boxes, and then the frame rails are all done. Everything's good with them. I'm happy with the fitment in general. Like I said, a lot of these frame rails, they do need some pulling and prying. So a lot of these supports and these reference points, you could see we have on the torsion bar support. There's been some on the frame rails before. This one, I didn't need it because I couldn't get those in with the front frame rails, the supports on the bottom. It just didn't fit. But if I'm doing one piece frame rail by itself, I can wedge those in and put supports up from the bottom. So sometimes I'll do that. It's not the end of the world. I'm pretty confident with the K-member, bolts and everything, that the front end is square in this car. Everything's straight and true, and this car will go down the road and be correct. You could see with the floor pan right there, backtracking a little bit, I used 4 bolts on the seat mounts Once those are in there, we're just kind of bolting in there, and I want to start putting, again, the whole car together before we weld anything else. The only thing we're going to weld is the frame rails and the torsion bar cross member, because we can't access them after. And again, that's the second time after the car's already been test fit. Once I get the firewall in there, I'll go ahead back to the floor pan and I'll start screwing it in. You could see right here, a lot of factory cars that come up off the center torsion bar cross member, just the hump doesn't match up. It's a little bit taller. I know why they do it. I understand it. I don't like the look of that. So what I like to do on a lot of these cars, I'll sit there and cut a slit in both sides, relieve some of the excess, and I'll hammer it down. It's not the cleanest from the inside, but think about this. On the inside of these cars, most people put center consoles there. There's automatic shift brackets. There's 4-speed humps is where this would go. So realistically, whatever happens here, you're really even not going to see this, even minus the carpet and the whole interior over here. But what this allows us to do, when I put this slit in both sides, when you look under this car, everything looks like it fits perfect on the floor pan to all the frame pieces, and it really tightens everything up looking at the bottom of this car and makes it look a lot more professional. So I'll deal with a little bit of, you know, welding and a little inconsistency on the top. I think that's the less of two evils versus looking underneath the car. And I get it, it's a lot better than factory and we're being a little bit OCD, but right here, again, talking with the owners of these cars, most of the time, that's what we're shooting for. We're shooting for a better quality than factory, a stronger car than factory that's going to just last longer. And that's the goal on most of these builds. So now that we got the front floor pan in, we're going to go ahead and put the rear toe pans in. You could see the rear toe pans are actually telling us the floor pan has to come up a little bit. So one of the brackets in the rear seat member looking down, I guess it's old, it was kind of bent down a little bit. So we'll go ahead and put a jack under it. I do want to get both toe pans in. I did push this side up, and what I did, I test fitted, I brought the center floor up, and then you could see there's weld through primer. I welded that first toe pan where this toe pan's going to sit over. So I welded, you know, the 4 or 5 inches along the top, put weld through primer, let everything dry. Now I get the other toe pan fit in, and then same thing, we're going to push the jack up in the back just a 1/4 inch or so, get that floor pan tucked up. And once we get this floor pan, this toe pan screwed into the floor pan, it holds everything together. This kind of just sets our back and our front of our floor pan. You know, we're going off those brackets. Again, we're going off 50, 60 years and assembly line workers that just threw them together. So one might be a little bit lower than the other. Now we're going to go do our side cowl pieces. So this is the main problem, which I had the hardest time was with this firewall and these front end pieces, these Dynacore. I just, like I said, if I was doing this and I was building this car, the frame rails would be the only thing in the car. And if the frame rails came with the shock tower, I would leave that on there. But those inner upper fender aprons and then the support brackets going to the upper cowl, I just wouldn't put them on there. It's just getting in the way of everything. So I'd put these side cowl panel pieces on first, the A-pillars, then come back with the firewall. But you see, the way we have to do it, we kind of have to wedge it in there. I'm not super happy with it, but I think we made a pretty good we made it successful. We made it work. I think this is some things you got to adapt and overcome when building these cars, since you're not doing it from the ground up. So you see, I use ratchet straps, and then same thing, this firewall, since it's being pushed in there, I'll have to come back through with a monkey on the stick and kind of push it even further, instead of putting this side cowl on first and then stretching the firewall over it. It's one of the things, like I said, you got to keep trying. You got to keep an eye on it. I can then slide the A-pillar under everything. It's kind of just sandwiching everything at once. Going back to what I said earlier, we're not welding anything in at this point until we know everything fits, unless we have to, because we can't access it in the back. I did also have to trim the front inner fenders because they were a little bit tight on the firewall. Like I said, I think they just put them back a little bit far. It's not the end of the world, but now that we got that whole area, we'll turn our attention to the lower radiator support. I did have to drill the radiator support versus the factory piece because these Dynacore pieces had this already put into them. So either I had to drill the Dynacore pieces or just the radiator support itself, the top cross piece. So I decided to drill the cross piece off first, and then we'll just install that part of it. At this point in the Cuda build, we have everything assembled on this car where we want it. I'm happy with it. So now we could start the tedious process of welding the whole entire floor. And this is where you're going to regret putting all those extra MIG holes. But we're going to sit there. I start on the center, mostly on the hump. I think that's the best way, and I'm going to work all my edges out. You can see there's a skip on the holes a little bit about where I'm about to be welding, and that's the torsion bar spring area. Like I said, these are where you mark on the bottom. There's nowhere to put MIG holes there. The factory skips them. You should skip them too. So like I said, we're going to start welding our way out, and then what I'll do, I'll work my way up the frame rails, and then I'll kind of come back, and you can see every couple welds I'm hammering everything down. We put plenty of screws in this floor pan to really tighten everything down. I use the screws. It takes, again, it's a little bit harder because you got to go back under the bottom of the car and weld up your screw holes, but realistically, it's a better product in the long run when you do it this way. You're just going to have everything tucked down a lot tighter, and you could put this car in a rotisserie and everything will be really tight and really good to do. So again, I probably use too many welds on these cars, and I probably use too many screws, but I think the end product and the result on, doesn't matter if you're building a Nova, a Cuda, you know, what make, a Mustang, the end result is the same in the metalwork. Just use lots of screws, support everything, and just try to assemble as much as you can before the welding process. So we're going to go ahead, and now that we got the floor done, I welded the toe pans, we got that whole section done. I worked my way up the inside of the cowl panels, and now we're on the outside of the cowl panels working our way up the A-pillars. I think the reason to do this, I mean, nothing's really going to move in the grand scheme of things, but doing it in a method, like an order like this, where you're working back or forward, you know, in a certain rhythm, and then I'll do the other side, you tend not to miss anything. There's so much welding done on this car, and it takes so long that it's so easy to just overlook a whole section, and you go through the whole epoxy phase and everything and not even realize it, you know, especially if you have two screws holding that panel in. So now that we got the side cowl, the A-pillars, everything MIG welded, we're going to come back through with the spot welder, and we'll go right through this firewall. You can see same thing, just I'm squeezing the trigger here. If you only have a MIG welder, you would put holes in this area and you just MIG up this area. Like I said, this is going to replicate what the factory did. It's the same process. It looks the same. I put a lot more in them, but what's nice about this is it doesn't burn too much, so it leaves a lot more weld through primer in it, and we don't have to come back through and grind down all the welds, and that's a whole tedious process in itself. But with the firewall to floor pan, I'll start in the center, and I'll work my way out, you could see. Then once I hit the frame rail, I come to the outside of the car, and I'll work my way up the cowl panel, the side cowl, to the firewall area. So we'll do that whole part, and then we can move on to the next phase. So this whole welding process is a mixture of spot welding and MIG welding, going back and forth. Another nice thing about having multiple welders and mixing up the processes back and forth is kind of pre-planned that the duty cycle on these welders, they both, especially my spot welders, are industrial machine, but it is air cooled. It does have a duty cycle on it. I tried not to make sure I don't overwork it because it'll last longer. So with this MIG welder, the MIG welder, same thing. You know, I've never hit the duty cycle on these small cars. It's a MIG 180, but like I said, it's just going to last longer if we can just sit there and just weld a little area, and if I come back in with the spot welder, use that for a little bit, and then go back to the MIG welder. Again, we're just not trying to push the tools to the brink of their limit, but anywhere I could spot weld, that is always the key, unless it's frame rail areas. I will come back through frame rails, and I'll use the spot welder sometimes, but I'll come back through and make sure I MIG weld a lot of areas. So I don't trust the frame rails with the spot welder. Again, I'm sure it's rated for it, and it's fine. It's just something that I know how my MIG weld is. I know how strong my MIG welds are, so all chassis components are MIG welded. So now you could see begins the tedious process of sanding down all our MIG welds. I'm going to use a belt sander for most of this. It does go through belts really quick, but I really think I could focus the welds and get the job done a little bit quicker. You can use, surface prep disc, and, right now I'm using 80 grit on this belt. I think anything deeper really starts gouging the metal, and you'll actually see some of the 80 grit scratches through the epoxy, but a lot of this stuff is going to go through bodywork phases. It'll be 2K, even chassis paint is going to cover most of these welds. So I just think the speed on it, it's a compromise between we get the job done, but we're not hurting the metal too much. If you were going to go through with a 120, it's going to double the time it takes to really scuff all this stuff down and prep it out. Once I'm done with the sanding disc, I'll come back through with the DA sander. Something else I want to throw out there that I didn't talk about earlier is this is an E-body universal rear frame rail floor pan section. You could see there's no holes for the gas tank, because on a Challenger, and I went over this in other videos, if you look at other floor pans, a Challenger gas tank would be on the passenger side coming through the side, where the Cudas are in the back. So to make it universal, just be aware this is something that you're going to have to cut out yourself on your E-body if you go this route. What I also didn't show was after I DA sanded the trunk floor, I continued that DA sand everywhere else that we are working on this car. That's going to just kind of smooth out those 80 grit scratches on the sanding belt and just give us a good clean surface in case any other kind of surface rust in the last couple of days did start to develop. Once I'm done with that, I'll come back through with a wax and grease remover everywhere we plan on priming, and then we'll come back through with our Omni MP170 epoxy. Epoxy is by far the best way to go in this restoration industry, especially the process that we're doing here. It's going to make it last for years and years to come. When I shoot my epoxy, again, I kind of with everything else, I'm looking forward in the process and I come up with a plan. I start on the inside of the firewall, and you're always trying to keep a wet edge. So I start on one side of the car on the firewall, I do a section, then I come to the other side. You could see it's still wet. There's a 15-minute induction period, so usually I'll be mixing my next round of epoxy as I'm spraying the current epoxy, and I'm putting 2 coats. So realistically, this job's so big, I could come through and work the floor pan, move on to the trunk pan, do the inner fender, firewall, engine bay area, work my way to the outside of that, and then by the time I come back around after the bottom of the car, which we're also shooting, I come back through and just keep round robbing it and start my second coat of epoxy. It just makes things easier, and the quality of this job I think comes out really good. So let's walk around for a couple final closeout thoughts and comments.
Looking at the timeline and everything on the video, we hit a good stopping point on the Cuda, so we're going to wrap up the video here. We didn't install the wheel houses or the cowl panel like I was initially going to do along with all the brackets up here, but we'll get that on the next video. So walking around this car, I think it looks very good. Everything is in 2 coats of epoxy. A couple spots on the floor I've dusted on the extra 3rd coat because I made a little bit more, but we sealed up under the firewall. I also taped off everywhere the weld through primer is going to be. This is a good stopping point because really the only weld through primers we have now are on the wheel houses and on this upper cowl panel to firewall where we're going to weld. The reason I did this is I want to make sure we get enough epoxy in here. Now that the epoxy's in, we'll come in the next video, see we're going to put some seam sealer around these inside cowl vents, and then we'll also epoxy underneath the upper cowl panel to seal it up. This is an area that always rots out on these E-body cars, so this is the area that we're going to address even a little bit more to make sure it doesn't happen in the future. So we'll get that installed. Like I said, these front panels, it made life, I guess, easier. I'm not a super big fan of these front frame rails from the Dynacore altogether. I personally, with my jig, would rather have them all separate pieces and me put them in. I had to cut the brackets off here going down, they didn't fit properly, and getting these side cowl pieces in with the firewall, it just made things challenging. I would say, I think these pieces are made that if you're just doing your car on jack stands and you want to just kind of slide a whole piece in there and your upper cowl and firewall and everything's done, and that's what they're kind of made for. For how my jig works about framing on the bottom, it can't go in both directions, and that's the same on the rear floor pan. I will say the rear floor pan did save a bunch of time. I mean, it was one big piece. We didn't weld back there. My spot welder's pretty efficient, so like I said, I'm happy with the fitment on it. I feel that if I was building it, I could do a little bit better job and kind of tweak it a little different and strip it down a little better. But again, I'm pretty happy with it. That's something I would probably install in the future. The floor pan, the firewall, and everything else fits really good. We focused more on the underneath of the car and the fitment and the tight frame rails. It gets a little bit rough around here, and what you also notice is I didn't put in the seat brackets on the inside of the buckets underneath, and there's no center console in this car, or automatic transmission brackets, or a 4-speed hump. The owner's still unsure what route he's going to go as far as seats and the shifting on this car. So he can do that work himself. That's something he asked to do. So right now you see it's just a bare floor. We're going to return. He's going to do little stuff. I also did repair both rockers on both sides now that we had the rear floor pan installed. The rear of this car is still not in yet. The next phase on this, like I said, we'll be installing these wheel houses, test fitting them. We're not putting them on. We got some more patching to do on the other side. The owner did decide that he was going to go ahead and replace this door jamb area, so we're waiting on that part to come in. And the reason we didn't do the trunk drop-offs back here and the wheel houses is we're waiting on the Cuda corner brackets. So another thing on the front end, another reason I didn't like them is we did have to remove the side. This would be the radiator support pieces, and the reason being is those pieces came with it. So this car needed a radiator support, so these had to be removed, cut off the car, and they're going to be thrown away. Also, like I said, all these parts, there's usually all bare metal. There's no weld through primer. You figure everything on this panel is going to be the same way in between these jams and everything. Not the end of the world, but be aware that any parts that we don't put together, that's what it's going to be. And it's the same thing with all these brackets. I took these brackets. These were the front brackets going down the cowl panel and the firewall, and I sandblasted them, and you could see same thing. There's just no weld through primer on them. It's just bare metal. It's what they do. They put them together and then they drop them in the E-coat. That's why usually if we have some rust or anything on these parts, I usually find that, I believe, on these larger panels because of that process. It takes more to assemble. They're more handling it, and then they dip it in, or however they apply the E-coat all at once. So saying that, I'm really happy. The car's starting to come together. It's starting to look a whole lot different now. We're going positive, going forward on this car versus stripping down some parts. So like I said, again, the next video is going to be trunk drop-offs, wheel houses. We're going to probably skin the doors, maybe put the doors on. We got some patching to do up there, and then the roof bracing patch on the other side. So that will be a lot of the next video, and then we'll just keep going. Oh, and the cowl panel. So we'll get all that stuff in those brackets. We'll get all that stuff kind of buttoned up, and then most of this chassis will be rigid. It'll be tight. It'll be all together, and it'll be ready for the external skins. This car really is coming together pretty quick for what it is. These big, large panels of these cars do make it happen a little bit quicker. I will say about the floor pans, especially on the Mopars, there is a lot of welding involved. This is time consuming, the grinding. This video, is sped up a lot and looks easy, but compared to the external panels where I could just spot weld, squeeze and go, this is a lot of work. But we got it done. It looks good. Like I said, I'm happy with it. I think the owner's gonna be. So stay tuned for the next video on the Cuda. We got other build videos out. I'm Rick from Carthage Classic Cars, and have a good day.